In the spring of 1241, the plains of eastern Hungary lay silent beneath a pale sky. The grasslands along the Sajó River rolled outward in long, open stretches, a landscape that offered little shelter and even less mercy. It was a frontier world. To the west stood the fortified cities and feudal hierarchies of Latin Christendom. To the east stretched an empire unlike anything Europe had ever faced, an empire that did not advance slowly, did not negotiate borders, and did not stop. The Mongols were coming. They had already shattered kingdoms that many in Europe barely understood. The destruction of the Kievan principalities between 1237 and 1240 had unfolded with terrifying speed. Cities such as Vladimir and Kiev had fallen in smoke and fire. Entire armies had been annihilated not by brute strength, but by mobility, discipline, and strategic deception. At the center of this westward surge stood the grandson of Genghis Khan, Bata Khan, commanding the western wing of the Mongol Empire under the supreme authority of Ogedei Khan. Alongside Bata rode the brilliant and methodical General Subutai, a strategist whose campaigns had spanned from China to the Caucasus. Subutai did not seek battles of honor. He sought total operational collapse. Their objective was not simple raiding. It was conquest and demonstration. Europe would learn what resistance meant. In Hungary, King Bela IV of Hungary faced a crisis that had been building for years. Hungary was not a weak kingdom. It controlled the Carpathian Basin and possessed one of the largest armies in Central Europe. Its nobles commanded armored cavalry. Its fortifications were strong. Its political influence extended across neighboring states. But internally, the kingdom was fractured. Bela IV had inherited a monarchy weakened by aristocratic privilege. Determined to restore royal authority, he had clashed repeatedly with Hungary's magnates. His efforts to centralize power alienated the very nobles he now needed. When word of the Mongol advance reached his court, unity was fragile at best. Then came another destabilizing decision. In 1239, Bela granted asylum to the Cumans, a nomadic Turkic people fleeing Mongol expansion. Their leader, Khotan, sought protection within Hungary's borders. Bela saw opportunity. The Cumans could provide light cavalry to counter Mongol mobility. But the Hungarian nobles, the Cumans were outsiders, pagans with unfamiliar customs and volatile loyalties. Tensions escalated. Accusations spread that the Cumans were secretly aligned with the Mongols. In early 1241, as fear intensified, a Hungarian mob murdered Khotan in Pest. The Cumans, enraged and leaderless, ravaged parts of the countryside as they withdrew southward. At the very moment Hungary needed cohesion, it fractured further. Meanwhile, the Mongol campaign was unfolding with deliberate precision. Subutai did not advance as a single column. He divided his forces across multiple axes, crossing the Carpathian passes through Poland and Transylvania simultaneously. In March 1241, Mongol detachments annihilated Polish and Silesian forces at the Battle of Legnica. European relief armies were shattered before they could unite. This was not coincidence. It was orchestration. The Hungarian army began assembling along the Danube, drawing knights, infantry levies, and regional contingents into a centralized host. Chroniclers describe a force that may have numbered between 40,000 and 60,000 men, though modern estimates suggest something smaller. Still, it was formidable by European standards, but it was not cohesive. The Hungarian military system revolved around heavy cavalry. Armored knights trained for decisive shock combat. Their doctrine favored direct engagement. Feigned retreat was viewed as cowardice. Encirclement was not a tactical concept, but a disaster. Against European armies, such methods often prevailed. Against the Mongols, they would prove dangerously obsolete. By April 1241, Mongol forces had crossed into the Great Hungarian Plain. Their movements were calculated. They burned villages selectively, allowing refugees to flood westward, spreading panic ahead of their approach. Scouts mapped river crossings and measured distances between supply lines. Communication flowed through signal flags and disciplined courier networks. They did not seek immediate confrontation. Instead, they maneuvered toward the Sajó River near the village of Mohi. The Sajó was not an imposing barrier, but offered something valuable, a defensive anchor. King Bela's advisors believed that if the Hungarian army camped on the western bank and fortified its position, the Mongols would be forced into a frontal assault across a narrow bridge. It was a rational assumption within a European framework of warfare. In early April, Hungarian forces established a fortified camp near the bridge at Mohi. Wagons were arranged into defensive lines. Tents clustered tightly within the perimeter. The army believed it had chosen a strong position, but they had unknowingly entered a trap. Subutai had no intention of launching a simple crossing at the bridge. His reconnaissance revealed alternative fords along the river. His engineers prepared pontoon bridges under cover of darkness. Battle positioned forces to create the illusion of a single point of attack. The Mongols were not reacting to Hungarian deployment. They were shaping it. On the night of April 10th, tension hung heavy over the Hungarian camp. Fires flickered along the riverbank. Knights rested in armor. Scouts reported Mongol activity near the bridge, confirming expectations of a frontal clash at dawn. Yet beneath the darkness, Mongol detachments moved silently to secondary crossings. Subutai's design was methodical. Engage at the bridge to fix Hungarian attention. Cross elsewhere to strike from unexpected directions. Compress the enemy within their own fortifications. Then apply sustained missile fire to break cohesion. It was a plan built not on bravery, but on geometry. The Hungarian command structure was ill-prepared for this kind of battle. Coordination between nobles was inconsistent. Discipline varied between units. The wagon fort, while defensively sound against conventional assault, restricted maneuverability once encircled. And still, many Hungarian knights believed the coming battle would be decisive, a chance to crush an eastern horde and restore confidence. They had heard stories of Mongol ferocity. They had not yet witnessed Mongol patience. Dawn approached slowly over plains of Mohi. Mist gathered along the Sajó. The river reflected a muted gray light. On the eastern bank, Mongol forces prepared in silence. Signals passed discreetly between commanders. Horses were rested. Arrows were bundled in tight sheaves. The Mongol army did not shout before battle. It waited inside the Hungarian camp. Priests offered prayers. Armor was secured. Commands were issued through layers of nobility, whose rivalries had not fully faded. Confidence existed, but beneath it, uncertainty lingered. They were facing an enemy whose methods defied expectation. Across the river, Battle and Subutai finalized their timing. The bridge at Mohi would become the focal point of attention, but it would not be the point of decision. The Hungarian army stood ready for a confrontation. It believed it understood. It did not yet realize that the battlefield had already been chosen for them, and that every step they had taken toward the Sajó had unfolded within a design crafted far beyond their sight. The sun began to rise, and with it, the quiet began to fracture. The first contact came before sunrise on April 11th, 1241. A Hungarian detachment had been positioned near the bridge over the Sajó, tasked with guarding the crossing through the night. They expected probing attacks, perhaps an attempt to force a span under cover of darkness. What they encountered instead was a sudden, concentrated Mongol assault meant not to break through permanently, but to pin them in place. Battle directed forces against the bridge in waves, using engineers to push forward under shields while archers saturated the Hungarian defenders with arrows. The narrowness of the crossing created confusion. Horses slipped. Men were struck before they could form coherent ranks. Yet the Hungarian defenders fought with determination and initially managed to hold the bridge, even pushing the Mongols back in a brief counterattack. Reports were rushed to the main camp that the enemy had been repelled. For a moment, confidence surged. It appeared that the Mongols had attempted precisely what Hungarian commanders had anticipated. But this engagement at the bridge was only one element of a larger maneuver unfolding beyond sight. Several kilometers to the south, under Subutai's direction, Mongol engineers had worked through the night, constructing a temporary bridge across a lesser guarded ford. The operation was conducted in silence and with remarkable speed. By dawn, entire units of mounted archers had crossed the river undetected. Their objective was not the bridge, not the fortified front, but the exposed flank and rear of the Hungarian camp. The geography of the Sajó plain offered little obstruction. Once across, Mongol cavalry fanned outward, positioning themselves in a broad arc that began close gradually around the Hungarian encampment. Inside the camp, the situation was still being interpreted through a narrow lens. King Bela IV and his leading nobles received word that the bridge attack had intensified again after dawn. They prepared to commit heavier forces to secure the crossing. The assumption remained that the Mongols sought a direct breakthrough at that fixed point. Hungarian knights mounted and formed for battle, armor glinting in the rising light. The heavy cavalry, pride of the kingdom, believed they were about to engage in a conventional clash, a contest of discipline and impact. Orders were issued to reinforce the bridge position. What few realized was that by concentrating attention forward, they were allowing their rear to remain dangerously thin. The first indication of the encirclement came not through formal reports but through alarm. Scouts and outlying units began encountering Mongol riders where none were expected. Dust clouds appeared on the southern horizon. Arrows began falling from angles that did not align with the bridge. Confusion spread rapidly. Hungarian commanders attempted to verify whether these sightings represented scattered raiders or coordinated movement. Within a short span of time, it became clear that Mongol forces were appearing simultaneously along multiple vectors. Subutai's plan relied on compression. Once sufficient units had crossed downstream, they advanced northward, striking the Hungarian camp on the flank while Batu renewed pressure at the bridge. The Mongols avoided immediate close combat. Instead, they established distance and began sustained mounted archery. Thousands of arrows arced into the Hungarian wagon fort. The defensive arrangement that had seemed secure the previous evening now became a trap. The wagons restricted rapid redeployment. Cavalry inside the perimeter found it difficult to maneuver without colliding with tents, supply carts, and infantry formations. Hungarian knights attempted to organize sorties to drive back the Mongol archers. When small groups charged outward, the Mongols executed controlled withdrawals, drawing pursuers farther from the camp before wheeling around and enveloping them. This was a pattern the Mongols had refined across Eurasia: provoke aggression, stretch cohesion, then isolate and destroy. The psychological effect was severe. European heavy cavalry doctrine emphasized decisive charges that shattered enemy lines. Instead, they encountered fluid resistance that dissolved on impact and reformed at range, loosing arrows continuously. As the morning progressed, the encirclement tightened. Subutai coordinated signals across his forces, ensuring that pressure remained constant from multiple sides. Smoke began rising within the Hungarian camp as Mongol projectiles ignited tents and wooden structures. Horses panicked. Infantry units clustered for protection. Shields raised against relentless missile fire. Communication between Hungarian commanders deteriorated. The density of the camp amplified disorder. Movement in one direction obstructed another. Attempts to mount coordinated counterattacks faltered because no single axis of engagement could be clearly defined. King Bela IV remained within the camp's central sector, attempting to assert authority amid the chaos. Messages arrived reporting Mongol forces behind their lines. Some nobles urged immediate breakout toward the west, arguing that remaining inside the wagon fort would lead to annihilation. Others insisted on holding position until reinforcements could stabilize the perimeter. The absence of unified command structure, already strained by prior political tensions, now translated into battlefield paralysis. Decisions were debated while the Mongols continued to shape the engagement through motion and distance. By midday, the Mongols had completed a near-total encirclement. They did not close immediately for hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they maintained a lethal perimeter, cycling mounted units forward to release arrows before withdrawing to resupply. Mongol logistics were organized for exactly this kind of engagement. Each rider carried multiple bows and abundant ammunition. Relay systems ensured steady replenishment. Hungarian forces, confined and compressed, began to suffer cumulative attrition. The heat of the day intensified exhaustion. Armor that had once symbolized strength now became burdensome under constant movement and stress. Water supplies grew difficult to access amid the crush of bodies and animals. Wounded men received minimal treatment. Arrows pierced through gaps in mail and lodged in exposed faces and limbs. The soundscape shifted from organized command to fragmented shouting and animal distress. The battlefield no longer resembled a contest of lines, but a tightening enclosure. Recognizing that sustained bombardment would eventually break morale, the Mongols prepared the final phase. Controlled openings were left along segments of the encirclement, deliberate gaps designed to encourage escape attempts. Subutai understood that a trapped army might fight with desperation. An army given the illusion of retreat would dissolve into flight. As pressure mounted, Hungarian units began pushing toward perceived weak points in the Mongol ring. At first, these movements were limited, small groups attempting to break through. Some succeeded in penetrating the outer skirmish lines, only to be pursued relentlessly across open ground by faster Mongol cavalry. Inside the camp, cohesion finally fractured. Nobles gathered their retainers and attempted independent withdrawals. The unified Hungarian host that had assembled along the Danube was now fragmenting into isolated clusters, each seeking survival. King Bela was persuaded by advisors that remaining in the camp was untenable. A guarded breakout was organized toward the west. Under heavy pressure, segments of the royal retinue managed to escape the immediate encirclement, though many were cut down in the process. What followed was not a single decisive clash, but systematic disintegration. Mongol cavalry exploited fleeing groups across the plains, encircling and destroying them in detail. Those who remained within the wagon fort faced intensifying assault as Mongol units finally advanced inward. Close combat erupted amid burning structures and overturned carts. The defensive perimeter collapsed inward under simultaneous pressure from multiple sides. The Battle of Mohi was no longer a contest between armies in formation. It had become an unraveling. Tactical discipline on one side met structural rigidity on the other. Every Hungarian attempt to reassert control encountered a battlefield already transformed beyond their doctrine. Subutai's orchestration, fixation to bridge, concealed crossing, encirclement, sustained missile attrition, and managed escape corridors had converted numerically comparable confrontation into asymmetrical collapse. By late afternoon, the Hungarian army had ceased to function as a coordinated force. Survivors scattered westward. The Mongols maintained pursuit until organized resistance disappeared entirely from the field. What had begun as a defensive stand along a river had evolved into one of the most devastating defeats suffered by a European kingdom in the 13th century. The plain of Mohi, so open and unremarkable at dawn, now bore the imprint of systematic destruction, not from overwhelming numbers, but from strategic design executed with precision. As night fell over the plains of Mohi, the remnants of the Hungarian army struggled to regain order, though order was a concept that had long since ceased to exist. Fire still burned along the wrecked camp, smoke rising in dark columns against the fading light. The stench of death and scorch were hung heavily in the air, mixing with the tang of iron from shattered weapons and trampled armor. King Bela IV, barely escaping with a fraction of his retinue, moved cautiously through scattered groups of fleeing soldiers, his presence offering little comfort to men whose cohesion had been shattered and whose morale had already crumbled. The psychological weight of the day's events pressed down on every survivor. European soldiers were trained to face the shock of battle head-on, to charge and break lines, to confront visible foes in disciplined formation. At Mohi, those expectations had been inverted. The enemy had not simply challenged them. It had eluded them, surrounded them, and then corralled them into a slow, grinding attrition that left no room for conventional strategy. Every instinct honed over years of training now worked against them. Armor became a hindrance. Heavy shields slowed movements, and mounted knights discovered that their speed was irrelevant when enemy riders constantly controlled the battlefield's angles and distances. Confusion, fear, and exhaustion combined into a pervasive sense of inevitability. Many men simply dropped their arms and fled into the woods, hoping that isolation might bring survival. Others attempted, desperate, disorganized charges that achieved nothing but their own destruction. The Mongols, for their part, did not pursue indiscriminately. Subutai's methodical approach extended even into the chaos of night. Reconnaissance units circled the battlefield to ensure no large groups of Hungarian forces could escape unnoticed. Small detachments exploited every opening, chasing down isolated clusters with precision. The psychological impact of being hunted, knowing that the enemy could appear at any angle at any moment, without warning, intensified the collapse. European heavy cavalry, previously invincible in head-on clashes, found that their armor, which had once been a shield of confidence, now restricted rapid maneuvers and left them vulnerable to coordinated arrow fire from multiple directions. Horses were injured or panicked in the open fields, throwing riders into confusion and further fracturing units. Survivors describe a sense of disorientation, as though the battlefield itself had shifted and moved around them, a landscape in which familiar tactics had no purchase. Every attempt at command was undermined by the Mongols' flexible, multi-pronged pressure and by the absence of reliable lines of communication within the Hungarian camp. By the following morning, the magnitude of the defeat had become unmistakable. Reports trickled back to King Bela for indicating the scale of losses. Entire contingents had been annihilated, noble lineages shattered, and the infantry that had once formed the backbone of the kingdom's defense effectively destroyed. The Hungarian heavy cavalry, the elite knights whose charge had been Europe's standard for decisive victory, had been rendered tactically impotent against a foe that exploited mobility, archery, and strategic patience. The Mongols, in contrast, suffered comparatively few losses. Their use of mounted archers to engage at distance, combined to control retreats and feign withdrawals, had allowed them to dictate the terms of engagement while minimizing risk. Subutized orchestration transformed what could have been a bloody stalemate into a near-total victory, a demonstration of operational design over brute force. The psychological and material collapse of Hungary was immediate and profound. Fortresses once considered impregnable now appeared irrelevant. Noble households were disrupted, and peasants witnessed the destruction of their feudal protectors, shattering faith in the kingdom's ability to defend itself. Even for those who had escaped the immediate battlefield, the terror of the Mongol advance loomed. Reports of devastation in Poland and Silesia confirmed that Mohi was not an isolated disaster, but part of a systematic westward campaign that had already struck fear into Europe's consciousness. King Bela fled to the western parts of his kingdom, seeking refuge and attempting to reorganize what remained of his forces. Yet the political consequences were as severe as the military ones. The murder of Khotin and the flight of the Cumans earlier had already weakened the internal cohesion of Hungary. Now, the king's authority faced an existential challenge. Nobles who survived the battle returned to their own estates, often with no intent to rally behind a central command. The Mongol threat, still active beyond the Sajó, rendered any attempt at conventional defense almost meaningless. Fortified towns and cities, previously secure under European military doctrine, were now vulnerable to encirclement and siege. The impression left by Mohi was not merely that Hungary had lost a battle. It was that European military structures, as they had been understood, were suddenly outdated against a foe that applied discipline, flexibility, and psychological manipulation with unprecedented effect. The lessons were as brutal as they were immediate. Heavy cavalry could no longer assume battlefield supremacy when confronted by highly mobile, missile-oriented forces capable of orchestrating multi-directional pressure. Rigid formations could be bypassed, encircled, and destroyed without a direct confrontation. Command structures relying on hierarchical nobility proved slow to respond to dynamic threats. The Mongols had not simply won a fight. They had demonstrated a comprehensive military philosophy that rendered conventional European methods vulnerable. The aftermath extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Within weeks, towns along the Danube were abandoned in panic. Refugees flooded toward the west, spreading news of annihilation and reinforcing perception of Mongol invincibility. Cities such as Pest, once bustling centers of administration and commerce, became temporary havens for the displaced, but they were poorly equipped to absorb the sudden population surge. In rural areas, survivors faced famine, disrupted harvests, and ongoing threats from Mongol foragers and raiding parties. The social fabric of Hungary was profoundly disrupted. Nobles who had survived Mohi had to contend with depleted retinues and diminished authority. Peasants, witnessing the destruction of their traditional protectors, were forced into a new reality of insecurity and fear. The psychological imprint of the Mongol victory at Mohi extended across Central Europe, shaping perceptions of both threat and vulnerability. Military leaders in neighboring regions observed the consequences and began reconsidering assumptions about defensive strategies, troop composition, and the value of heavily armored cavalry in open plains engagements. Historically, Mohi marked a turning point not only for Hungary, but for European military thought. It became a clear illustration that strategic flexibility, reconnaissance, and psychological warfare could achieve what brute force alone could not. Subutai's combination of mobility, deception, and disciplined archery outmaneuvered a European army that relied on shock tactics, rigid formations, and assumptions of frontal engagement. The Hungarian army's collapse was complete. What had begun as a confident assembly of knights and infantry ended in rout, death, and displacement. For King Bela IV, the immediate focus was survival and reconstruction. In the longer term, the defeat forced Hungary to reconsider fortification policy, recruitment, and alliances, including renewed engagement with nomadic allies whose utility had been previously underestimated. Across Europe, the shock of Mohi instilled a cautious respect for the Mongols. Chroniclers, clerics, and diplomats recorded both the scale of the defeat and the methods employed, providing future generations with insight into a military doctrine that emphasized patience, observation, and multi-layered engagement over the kind of decisive, single-point battles familiar to European knights.